Okay, welcome back to the poetry unit. It felt more than a bit weird to be recording video lectures and discussing the poetry alone in our apartments via an internet discussion board, where Romanticism was concerned over the course of 2 and 3 weeks ago. But for reasons that I hope will become clear over the course of the next however many minutes, such an environment, such a situation is sadly entirely appropriate to the next literary movement up for discussion, modernism. Okay, now when we talk about modernism, we are talking about, well, casually, we can just say the first half of the 20th century. A bit more specifically, we could say the period from the First World War to the Second one. So the 19 teens through the 1940s. Now, although there were other concerns, reactions to the increasingly alienated feeling from modern technology, so it can even be sort of seen as a continuation of the way that Romanticism 100 years earlier had been a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. The short answer is that modernism, the modernist movement in the arts, is a reaction to the horrors of the First World War. Now, all wars suck, of course, but World War One sucked especially hard, even for a war. If you're not immediately able to picture which one that was the one with the trenches and the poison gas and the gas masks. It was also the first one with tanks, the first one with planes dropping bombs on you, the first one with long-range artillery, machine guns, the first technological mechanized war, the first one where you didn't see the guy you were killing, where people were killing each other from that far away. It was the beginning of what, by the end of the 20th century, people were calling the idea of war as a video game. The process of killing becoming mechanized, impersonal, technological, abstract, distant, technology making it easier for people to kill one another on a mass scale. Now, artists, being all sensitive and stuff, blamed themselves and started thinking, well, maybe this was our fault, right? Oh, and on top of it, it was all for no reason. It wasn't, one of those wars like, okay, at least in World War II, where even more people died, at least there was a good reason the world had to team up to stop Hitler. World War I was for no good reason that anybody could figure out. Some Archduke got shot, and then, Germany got pissed at Serbia, Russia got pissed at Germany, England and France saw an opportunity to grab some land. The Ottoman Empire was involved for some reason. After a while, predictably enough, America said, well, no one's allowed to have a war without America, and got involved as well. By 1918, many millions of people were dead. A whole generation almost of young men had been wiped out in all of the aforementioned countries. Very little had been achieved in any identifiable way, and in November of 1918, the whole thing was called off. So artists were horrified by this. Thought, this could have been thought out better. This whole war thing that just happened. Everybody got, and of course I'm oversimplifying to a almost ludicrous degree here, but it seems like everybody got caught up in their emotions and stuff here, rushed into this, all caught up in passion without thinking it through logically. Maybe all this emotion stuff that art was emphasizing leading with your heart instead of your head, all that romanticism stuff from the 19th century. Maybe there's a downside to that. Maybe we were too hard on all of that reason and logic and critical thinking stuff from the Enlightenment. Maybe we should cool it with the emotion and bring back a bit of that logic and reason stuff. Maybe that would prevent things like the Great War, as it was called, from happening again. So, towards art as being a up here thing again, rather than a down here thing, as it had been in the during neoclassicism in the 1700s, in the most of the 1700s before Romanticism happened. And when we are, remember, just as with Romanticism in the beginning of the 19th century, this is one of those terms that is not applicable just to poetry or just to literature, but to all of the arts, right? So just like in the early 1800s, we weren't just talking about Wordsworth or Byron or Keats as being romantic poets, but also talking about Beethoven as being a romantic composer. Modernism also is a movement that spans different artistic genres. It's what's going on in literature. It's also what's going on in music. It's also what's going on in painting. It's also what's going on in architecture. And this might be where we would start in terms of incorporating it into what we already sort of have heard of or what we already know. As far as poetry specifically is concerned, the short answer might be, well, it's when poetry stopped rhyming or stopped being primarily about love. Even though before the 20th century there had been, as we saw with Walt Whitman last time, or Christopher Smart back in the 1700s, there had been free verse. And every once in a while there was, a poem about something besides love. But people have this oversimplified general idea that, okay, once upon a time, poetry rhymed and was about love, and nowadays hardly any poems rhyme and hardly any poems are about love. When did that change? That's oversimplified, of course, but that stereotype doesn't come from nowhere. So to the extent that we want to engage it, we could say the answer to that question is modernism. That's when it changed. That's when it became the norm for poems to not rhyme, the norm for poems to be about intellectual stuff instead of about love or some other emotion. That's when poetry got, for lack of a better word, hard, right? The idea that poetry is a hard thing that you do in school, right? As opposed to a pretty thing that people actually like. We have modernism to, if we want to use the word blame for this change, whether it's accurate or not. That's the stereotype, and that this is where the stereotype comes from. Now, we might relate it to changes that were going on in the other arts at the same time, right? Perhaps we might, just as for Romanticism a couple of weeks ago, when I said to imagine the difference between the Enlightenment and the Romantic era, first listen to Mozart and then listen to Beethoven. Remember how Mozart feels like it's about technical perfection and intellectual showing off, and Beethoven seems like it's about painful emotion that you can't express the right way or can't get over, and that emotion feels like the difference between neoclassical and romantic poetry. With modernism, we might invoke, by way of analogy, the visual arts. Over on the art history, over on the painting side of things, modernism is when paintings stopped looking like stuff, right? We also, even if we're not experts, have this general idea that once upon a time, painters made paintings that actually looked like a thing from real life, a person or a landscape or whatever. And then at some point, painting modern art, what people mean when they say modern art became, a bunch of shapes and colors that don't actually look like a thing from real life, and you have to figure out what it symbolizes or whatever. That's what's going on. That change is what's going on over in painting, just as the changes we're about to examine are going on in poetry. So people like T.S. Eliot and Gertrude Stein, the modernist poets, are contemporaries of, say, Picasso over on the painting side of things. Now, partly, just as with painting, this didn't happen for no reason, right? Because in the mid 1800s, cameras were invented, right? So if all you want is for something to look exactly like the real person or the real place, you don't need a painter to do that anymore. You can just take a photograph. And, rather than just say, okay, we won't have there be such a thing as painting anymore, painters ask themselves, well, what can we do that a photograph can't do? Maybe there's something we can do other than realism, other than looking exactly like the person or looking exactly like the place. And so first you had Impressionism, as exemplified in the work of people like Van Gogh, where, okay, it's still a real place, but it looks kind of funny. The colors are a bit off, or that Seurat guy who's doing it with a bunch of dots. And then by the early 20th century, you have people like Picasso, where it's like, okay, I think there's a hint of a real person or real place in there, but mainly it's kind of a bunch of weird shapes that I have to figure out. So if we want to think of, certainly in terms of extreme modernists like Gertrude Stein as trying to do the same thing with language, where it's no longer an identifiable a sentence or narrative, but a bunch of words that feel like something. But even in the case of people who are still writing in grammatical complete sentences, like T.S. Eliot or William Butler Yeats, there is still an identifiable change from what had come before. And this is because poetry gets very, how should we put it? Well, what I have here, for those who can't read it, is that modernism is more concerned with society and history than with individual emotion. Now, we still do see in someone like T.S. Eliot, at least early on, that he is still expressing the emotions of an individual, but there's more of a feeling that those are getting lost in the shuffle, that they are, to use a musical analogy, way down in the mix, rather than being up front in the mix, as they had been in the 19th century. More concerned with society and history than with individual emotion, right? With the big picture. Gone is the idea of the individual poet walking around in the woods and reacting to nature. There's no more of an escape from society or civilization. There is a realization, just like, in fact, now that I think of it, we might go all the way back to the short story unit and remember Gabriel Conroy's epiphany at the end of James Joyce's The Dead, that he is Irish, whether he likes it or not, is tied to all of these people. That some idea of escape for just him as an individual is not in fact possible. This is a very modernist realization. The last line of T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock refers to waking up, right? Until human voices wake us and we drown. The idea that previous literature, that 19th century literature, that capital R romantic literature, had been this dream, a very pretty dream, but it was time to wake up. It was time to get real. So the problems don't actually go away just because an individual poet walks around in the woods and thinks about flowers and rainbows instead of. civilization and what's happening to it, right? So we're getting closer and closer to the mid 20th century idea that, okay, if if somebody blows up the whole freaking place, this affects all of us, poets or not. So it's very concerned with where entire societies and with where the march of history, the progress of history is headed, rather than with the individual. It's characterized by an ironic self-awareness regarding the creation of art. Um, it's poetry about writing poetry, right? Just as the paintings of the same period were paintings about making paintings. Um, Often formally experimental and deliberately hard, right? When you read a romantic poem, you in the best ones almost forget that you're reading a poem and just the emotion takes over. The modernists want you to be very aware that you are reading a poem, and think about what that means and how it was put together. Um, and down here at the bottom, I say it's the first movement in literature that has to compete with new art forms like movies and popular music. Now, there have, of course, had always been music, but up until the 20th century, if you wanted to hear music, you needed to go hear it played live. By a couple of decades into the 20th century, there's the radio that you can turn on and listen to music at home, and there's records that you can go buy in record stores and play on record players. So there's the beginning of what would, over the course of the 20th century, become this divide into quote unquote high art and quote unquote low art, where up here there's classical music and sculpture and opera and painting, and down here there's movies and popular music and eventually television and TV shows, comic books, and poetry and literature. At least for the time being, are up here with the high arts. Now, in the next video, when something like beat poetry comes along, by the 1950s, we'll see those poets try to escape the idea of poetry as one of the quote unquote high arts, and engage with the common people, the younger people, alongside things like popular music and comic books, thinking, oh, poetry should be for the people. It should be down here with TV and music and comics, not up here with opera and sculpture or whatever. So yes, modernism will be succeeded by people like the Beats, and we'll see the pendulum swinging back the other way, back into the sort of romantic direction of okay, that's enough intellectual games. Let's bring poetry back to the people again. Modernism is the beginning of the idea that we are in many ways still stuck with today, the idea of poetry as something to be analyzed by nerds in school, rather than poetry. We talked about the romantics, especially the second generation romantics, being sort of rock stars a century and a half early, certainly in terms of who was reading them, in terms of their fans, right? Poetry was the main thing that the cool kids liked during the early 1800s. Now we have new art forms coming to push aside poetry and to fill that void over the course of the 20th century. And so there is, and I'll close the prefatory comments here with this before we turn to some actual poems, there is a kind of chicken or the egg question to be asked regarding this idea. Did a popular audience, a broad audience, abandon poetry because it got hard? Or did poetry get hard because a popular audience abandoned it, right? Was it that the modernists were so difficult that regular people went, I can't make head or tail of this poetry stuff. I'm going to watch movies and listen to records instead? Or did poets see the writing on the wall and go, you know what? Regular people aren't going to be primarily reading books when they want to engage with some art in their spare time. From now on, they're going to be at the movies or they're going to be listening to records. So we might as well get more difficult. We might as well start writing hard stuff for an audience of nerds because no matter what we do, regular people aren't going to be reading us anyway. So, what caused what? Anyway, let's turn to the actual poems in the packet. Now, we've got a bunch in here. In the interest of not making this 6 hours long, we're not going to be able to closely go over every single one. But, well, since I'm staring at it, and you probably are too, let's look at the poem on the first page, Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. Now, that title is Latin. It's a quote from the ancient Roman poet Horace. More on what that means in a second. Now, as you've already probably intuited, the poem is about war, and Wilfred Owen is not merely using his imagination here. He actually was a soldier in the First World War, and unfortunately, he didn't make it. He was killed in action. I think like just the day before, or 2 or 3 days before, or something, the armistice on 11/11, November 11th, 1918, when they called off the war. So yes, that was, for the younger viewers, known for many, many years as Armistice Day. It was a holiday about the day the First World War ended. In other countries, it still is called that. America, at some point, changed the name of it to Veterans Day. I guess America didn't want to have a holiday that was called the same thing that other countries call it. I liked Armistice Day. I liked the idea of a holiday about a war ending, but nobody asked me. Anyway, yes, we only even have Wilfred Owen's poetry because he was mailing them home to his mom in letters. Some of his poems were even found on his body after he was killed, in his pockets with his blood on them. He was only 21 or 22 or something. So now, structurally, when we look at this, we might say, well, it isn't really a modernist poem, right? I mean, even though what he's describing here, in a phrase like knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, that's not pretty sounding. The gutturalness of many of the lines in here, the music of it. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, it almost sonically reminds us of Anglo-Saxon poetry with all of those schwas, those sounds, and all of those the diphthongs and s sounds. It's not something you would ever think about singing. So sonically, it is a bit new, but structurally, Owen is still using the pentameter. Right, the lines are going da 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 da. Of course, up until the very last line, where the line is cut short, just as Owen's own life was. And he is still rhyming in a traditional form, a sax, sludge, backs, trudge. So we've got A, B, rhyming, odd and even lines taking turns rhyming. So the most traditional rhyme scheme, the most traditional meter that one could imagine. Even, already becoming a bit old-fashioned technically by 1917, 18, or whenever he wrote this one. Now, presumably, he would have gotten a bit more modern had he lived, but of course he did not. So we might see a poem like this as sort of like the last non-modernist poem, or there's something right on the border that is, it's a snapshot from the war. There's something new is in the process of being created, but a young poet who's, I guess, dodging bullets as he's writing it and has other things on his mind than formal innovation, is still clinging to the old forms that we will see abandoned with great flair on the subsequent pages of the modernist packet. But it closes with a very modernist move, a rejection of an earlier, long-standing historical idea as BS. If you could have seen all the stuff I described in the first 3.5 stanzas, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria more. Now, those words from the ancient Roman poet Horace mean sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. You can sort of suss them out if you have any Spanish or Latin. Dulce, sweet, de patria, country, like in patriotic, mori, to die, as in mortal or mortuary. Now, that was a very Roman value, the idea that it was glorious to die in battle for your country. Owen calls this not only a lie, but the lie, the old lie. Note the ungrammatical capitalization of the word lie, capitalizing it to emphasize it, as we saw Dickinson doing much more frequently in the last video. I think it's the only technically ungrammatical move in the poem. So Owen is implying, just with that subtle act of capitalization, that this idea that dying for your country is a good thing that should be admired is not just a lie, but the central lie of all human history. And that whatever comes next, certainly in the arts, it's going to involve, among other things, waking up from or rejecting this lie. Now, let's flip to. Okay, well, let's do just an overview. We've got on the next page, the next several pages, T.S. Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. We are going to turn to that in some depth a bit later. There we see, and this would have been, I think, the first widely noticed, maybe, hit of the modernist movement. We might, if we want to look at one poem and say, okay, well, this is the, Smells Like Teen Spirit of modernism, just as we analogized a few videos ago that perhaps Wordsworth's Intimations Ode was the Smells Like Teen Spirit of romanticism. We might well nominate Eliot's Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock as the modernist equivalent. Clearly, when this was published in 1917, something very, very new was going on as far as how a poem sounds, how it feels, what it looks like on the page. We'll flip to that in more depth in a bit. After it, in the packet, we've got William Butler Yeats's The Second Coming. Formally, a bit more traditional. We still do have not as bouncy as we heard it in Owen, but we still do have a rough pentameter here, still more or less a da 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 in each line, though any hint of rhyming is quickly abandoned. Now Yeats, you know what? We'll turn to Yeats in just a bit. Let me give you a sneak preview of any. By the way, although we're not going to look at every poem in the packet in this video, when I open up the discussion board, we can certainly do new threads for all of the poems in the packet. We've got Langston Hughes up next, the central figure of what was called the Harlem Renaissance. At the same time that modernism was a the sort of umbrella term for everything that was happening. We, of course, during the same era had sub movements. Among them, the first African American literature that was getting widely noticed and critically respected and incorporated into discussions of what was going on in literature. Langston Hughes, the central poetic figure of what was called the Harlem Renaissance, which was the pretty term for writing by Black Americans in the 1920s and 30s. Now, in a poem like Let America Be America Again, we see, a sound that is a bit different, a bit more sonorous, a bit more musical, more accessible in terms of what he's saying than we see in going on a lot of other pages in the Modernism packet. So African American literature, of course, would be, for many obvious reasons, an exception to the whole let's write difficult stuff that nerds have to figure out thrust of the mainstream modernist movement. Hughes had readers in mind who would not, of course, have had as much access to fancy educations as the readers of someone like T.S. Eliot would have been expected to have. He was also, as some of you may already have intuited by reading it, a huge fan of Walt Whitman. We see Whitman quoted in near the bottom of the first page. I am the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream, beaten yet today. Oh, pioneers, I am the man who never got ahead, the poorest worker, bartered through the years. The call, the cry, the exhortation, oh, pioneers, is a quote from Walt Whitman. We see also echoes of Whitman's fondness for anaphora, right, for a bunch of lines in a row beginning with the same word or same few words in Hughes's work. As Whitman had been doing in a poem like Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which we examined in the last video, we see Hughes addressing a concept of America, but more skeptically than Whitman had been doing. Now, there would be two main reasons for this, I suppose. It's a few decades later, a couple of decades into the 20th century rather than a few decades away from the end of the 19th. So there had been more time to call BS on the idea of progress that Whitman had been praising roughly half a century earlier. But also, of course, the fact that Whitman was white and Hughes was black. So the extent to which the American dream was not all it was cracked up to be clearly would have been a bit more obvious an observation to make for a black man than it had been for a white man. Now, the thing they had in common, of course, is that they were both Whitman and Langston Hughes were both gay at times when you could not openly admit that you were gay. So we do still have that. And it's great poetry to put side by side there and talk about the similarities and differences for anyone who's looking ahead to some sort of compare contrast paper for the poetry unit. Whitman and Hughes are great to put side by side since you've got structural similarities, differences in terms of maybe of Hughes being more skeptical of America, even as he well, is, I suppose, more forgiving of the idea of America than you might expect him to be. But you've also got that central secret or sadness or unspoken pain about their personal lives at the heart of both of their oeuvres. We've got two of the most famous extremely short poems in English literature, courtesy of William Carlos Williams. We might look at those in more depth in a bit. We've got Marianne Moore with a poem called Poetry that, refreshingly enough, begins with the admission, I too dislike it. Acknowledging the fact that, okay, let's be honest here, everyone hates poetry, but if you demand, on the one hand, the raw material of poetry in all its rawness, and that which is, on the other hand, genuine, you are interested in poetry. With Marianne Moore, we have a immediate visual impression of flipping the page to first look at the poem. We go, okay, what the heck is this? This is going to be hard. Look at those lines. It being very aggressively unmusical, unpretty, very obviously created, right? It's not trying to look, a word that's very popular today, organic, right? The poetry of someone like Marianne Moore is not trying to look naturally occurring, as though it flowed out of the air and the streams and the rainbows, as the poetry of someone like Wordsworth or Keats had done. She's calling your attention to the fact that this is an artificial thing that a person made. But despite this, the poem implies maybe there's something to it anyway. We'll be let's be honest with each other about the fact that it's fake. But we might still be dealing with, in the most famous phrase from the poem, imaginary gardens with real toads in them. Even though poetry, in other words, and all art is, of course, quote unquote, fake, there might be something to it anyway. We've got E.E. Cummings with the gorgeous Somewhere I Have Never Traveled, Gladly Beyond, proving that even at the peak of modernism, there is still a breath or two that can be spared to say I love you, still a place for a poem that doesn't have any agenda other than being a love poem. Now it is, of course, formally challenging. We've got E. Cummings' famous affinity for only using lowercase letters, for challenging us with the poem's syntax, right? Word order is a bit weird. You still, to obey the modernist Ezra Pound's famous invocation to make it new, you don't want to say the same old thing. People are never going to get tired of saying I love you, but you've got to find new ways to say it because the old ways to say it were said already. A gorgeous poem. Nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands. We've got Dylan Thomas's famous Villanelle, do not go gentle into that good night, quoted in any number. If it sounds familiar, they're always quoting it in movies. I'm sure you've seen at least a few where somebody quotes this poem for one reason or another. A very difficult form a villanelle. You've got to repeat those same two lines, right? The first and third lines of the opening stanza have to get reused as the terminal lines of stanzas 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then back to back at the end. So you're creating a problem that you have to solve. Everybody knows how the poem is going to end as soon as it begins. They already know what the last two lines are going to be. So how do you make them new? Is coming up on the tail end of modernism here, at least chronologically. W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939. If that date sounds familiar, that's probably from social studies class. It was the official start date of World War II, at least the European theater of World War II. It was the date that the Nazi tanks rolled across the border into Poland, and Britain and France finally, as a result, declared war on Germany. So we have, and it's one of the things I love about this poem, this Auden poem, a very, very big thing going on, and in the middle of it, this tiny human voice, wondering, what the hell can I do about any of this? What good is a poem in the face of this enormous and obviously extremely deadly thing that's about to go on for God knows how long? And so we have Gone is the capital R romantic poet whose voice out in the woods is so important. We have here almost as though the human being becomes a tiny mouse or insect dwarfed by all of the big things in this poem, that is surrounded by skyscrapers and nations and history, and concluding, I suppose, all such a voice realistically can conclude. May I, composed like them of eros and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. Be the best insect you can be, I suppose. And on the last page, we've got no, there's nothing wrong with your printer. That is actually what the poetry of Gertrude Stein looks like. And you know what? I guess I'll close with one of those. Let's get to an actual in-depth analysis of, I think your poll winner for best or most famous, certainly most often referenced modernist poem is going to be William Butler Yeats's The Second Coming. So go ahead and flip to that one. It's the third one in the packet right after Eliot. Now, Yeats, an Irish poet, a contemporary of James Joyce, who we remember from the short story unit. They're the twin giants of not just modernist Irish literature, but I suppose all Irish literature, not in direct competition with each other, since Joyce wrote stories and novels and Yeats wrote poetry. His career was very long. His first couple of books came out in the late 1800s, and they were almost late romantic in tone, very capital N nature-y, very pretty, lots of stuff about swans and rivers and even fairies and mystical stuff. But when modernism became the thing to do, rather than fading away with his fairies and his swans, Yeats changed his style and got at least as modernist as anybody. Okay, so you know what? Let's hear the whole thing. The Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falcon. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere, in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Now, even though I'm not reading all of the poems out loud in the videos, I am reminded to remind you, be reading these out loud to yourself. I mean, we're all in quarantine. Nobody's going to hear you. You learn a lot about a poem by hearing it, and even better, feeling it come out of your mouth. So the first thing we notice about this is, although it is in one sense musical, right, rhythmic, there's a sense of great oratory to it, of chanting, of wisdom. It feels ancient. It feels carved in stone. It is also very, very unpretty, or to use its own term, its own adjective from the penultimate line, rough. You would never dream of attempting to set this to music and sing it. Though some have tried, I believe both Lou Reed and Joni Mitchell. So before we even start to line by line decode it, and it is a difficult poem, we might start with the mood. Whatever is being talked about is extremely important, but not something good. We don't get a vibe from this, like figuring out what it's like. When we figure out what it's about, it's not going to be something that makes us feel better, right? It's not going to be, like some good news from Wordsworth about childhood innocence and what we can all learn from it or whatever. It is probably going to be bad news. Okay, so now, we might, as we have in other poems, start with the title, The Second Coming. We might recognize as being a religious phrase specific to Christianity. It has traditionally refers to the idea of Jesus coming back, to initiate the rapture, or the Armageddon, the final battle with the Antichrist, or whatever. Traditionally after 2,000 years, though it now being the year 2020, fewer people believe that than had in the past. We do see 20 centuries, aka 2,000 years, referred to 4 lines from the end, but we also see a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with or predates Christianity. In the second stanza, one of the first things we can suss out is that shape with lion body and the head of a man. We go, okay, well, that's a description of this Sphinx, that famous half person, half lion statue from Egypt near the pyramids, and that thing is that's from way before Christian, thousands of years before Christianity. So we're what exactly is going on here in terms of what's getting combined with or mixed up with what. Those are the things we might recognize initially, right? The sound, the title, an image or two that seem familiar. So we've narrowed down what meaning we expect. Now let's start to line by line it. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. Okay, so first line, there's already a word that we probably don't know unless we're huge geometry buffs. Now, a gyre is a path up an inverted cone in concentric circles. So, for example, the thread of a screw goes in a gyre. Okay, so there's our widening gyre. We're told that what's creating it is the falcon, a bird of prey related to eagles and hawks. So we'll put our falcon up there. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. We know what a falcon is. What was a falconer? Okay, well, if you've seen in movies set in the Renaissance or Middle Ages, the guy with the big ass glove with the bird on it, right? And the bird's got a hood on, and he takes the hood off, and the bird goes off and kills a rabbit or whatever and brings it back. That guy was the falconer, the trainer of the falcons. So we'll put him down here. Give him a little hat. There's his big ass glove. So we begin with an image. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. So the in terms of what we're supposed to take this as symbolic of. Okay, well, what is the relationship between the falcon and the falconer? Right, the falcon is an organic and naturally occurring thing, an animal. People capture them and train them to kill, right? To go and hunt and kill things and bring them back to us. The falconer is supposedly in charge, but we're told that the falcon has gotten so far away that it can no longer hear the commands of its supposed master. So the turning in its widening gyre, it's and if you've watched birds of prey, right, that's what they do. They take off and get ever higher in concentric circles with their eyes on the ground looking for something to dive down and kill. So in short, the thing that we have trained to kill has gotten away from us and is no longer listening to us, no longer obeying or hearing our commands. When it's put that way, we go, okay, that's not good. So this idea of the thing we thought we were in control of, the instrument of violence, of death that we thought we were in control of, getting away from us, can't hear us anymore, isn't listening to us anymore. Look how oft used or how important that idea became over the course of the 20th century. How many, especially in science fiction, something like Asimov's I, Robot, or the Terminator films, right? The concept of Judgment Day in the Terminator films, the moment when Skynet becomes self-aware, right? The robots that we built as weapons of war that we thought we were the masters of get so advanced that they turn on us. Here at the beginning of the 20th century, we see that image or that idea, begin to get created. So decades and decades ahead of when we would see it start to get used over and over and over in science fiction films, just as we saw in a poem like Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a very early iteration of that familiar idea from horror movies of, oh, you were too proud and you built your whatever it is on sacred ground, on a place that was important to capital N nature, where humans weren't supposed to build stuff. So now capital N nature is going to rise up and punish you. Coleridge is already messing with that idea in 1798. And a century and a half later, it becomes popular in horror films. Here we have Yates almost coming up with a sort of uh, Terminator-like idea about where we were headed with technology, specifically, I suppose, military technology or the technology of death, decades early. So the falcon cannot hear the falconer. The thing we've trained to kill is not listening to us anymore. As a result, things fall apart. We get the deliberately vague things fall apart. What things? Take your pick. There is no one thing we agree on anymore. No mainstream anymore. There ain't going to be any middle anymore, as Pearl Jam put it in the 90s. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. That mere reminds me of at the beginning of the Shakespeare's mere, the mere oblivion in the second to last line of the All the World's a Stage speech. Here we have mere anarchy. Is loosed upon the world as though it's something external to us that has escaped. A sort of Pandora's box being opened. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Now, the blood-dimmed tide, this is a biblical idea. Oceans running with blood. Everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Does Yeats have a specific ceremony in mind? Not as far as I know, but you hear a phrase like the ceremony of innocence is drowned. And you know that's not good, right? If there's a ceremony of innocence that gets drowned, that's a bad thing. So we move in that first stanza from this very specific initial image to a bunch of a series of general statements that just make us go again and again and again, oh crap, that's not good. Oh crap, that's not good. Oh crap, that's not good. Culminating in two of the most useful lines of poetry you're ever likely to hear. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Conviction, in what sense? Not conviction in the sense of being found guilty of a crime, but to have conviction, to have the courage of your convictions, right? To believe that what you are doing is right, to believe in yourself. We're told that the best lack all conviction, i.e. good people don't believe in themselves. Meanwhile, while the worst are full of passionate intensity, bad people are, super into what they're doing and believing in themselves. Now, this is in 20 syllables. Yeats has expressed what I feel is a central, heck, maybe the central problem of human society. We teach you when you're young, don't be 100% sure that you're right. Keep an open mind, examine your own beliefs, don't push other people around and tell them what to do. And that's good advice. But the problem is, as with most good advice, only good people listen to it. Bad people, on the other hand, are always 100% sure that they're right and love pushing other people around and telling them what to do. Now, if somebody has to be in charge, if somebody has to be telling everybody what to do, it should be these good people over here, but they're too good to do it. They're sitting there doubting their own beliefs and going, well, maybe this and maybe that. Meanwhile, there's nothing assholes like better than being 100% sure that they're right and pushing everybody around. So they're the ones who end up doing it. So no matter what year it is, 100 years ago when Yeats wrote this poem, today, 100 or 500 or 1,000 years from now, if somebody asks, why is stuff so messed up? Why are there so many problems? There's a good chance that you'll basically be right if you answer by saying the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So what the first stanza adds up to is, right, it feels like the world is about to come to an end. Right, it seems in places like a short version of what's going on in that great poem by Lord Byron, Darkness, that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. Everybody's running around killing each other. It's chaos. The world is in the process of ending. Now, we might remember the title here. Yeats, unlike Byron, remember it was a salient feature of Byron's poem that no religion at all, except insofar as we're setting the stuff from the church on fire to keep warm. Yeats gives this poem a religious title, right? Whereas Byron's Apocalypse featured only darkness, right, the complete absence of everything. Yeats refers to a religious idea in his title, The Second Coming. But we see in the second stanza that it's going to get dispensed with rather quickly. We have this first stanza describing what seems like the end of the world, and Yeats, as many of his readers would have done, falls back on the idea of, well, wait a minute. If the world is ending, the good news is that means Jesus is coming back, right? That's what they taught us in school was going to happen when the world ends. So he looks around at the early world in the early 20th century, seems like it's about to come to an end, and goes, well, the good news is I guess that means Jesus will be here any minute, right? Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. And then the phrase is repeated, third line, second stanza, the second coming. Like as though as soon as he says it, he realizes how silly he sounds to expect that Jesus is going to show up and save everyone or save all the good people or whatever. Kind of like what Keats does with the word forlorn at the end of Ode to a Nightingale. In fairylands forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. The fancy cannot cheat so well as he is famed to do, right? But merely by saying the word forlorn, Keats, right, this synonym for depressed, merely by saying the word, Keats reminds himself that there is such a thing as depression. And it breaks the spell that the Nightingale had cast. Here, Yeats, as soon as he's like, oh, well, I guess that means it's the second coming, and realizes how crazy that sounds. The second coming, like that's not going to happen. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. So, just as in the Wilfred Owen poem from a few pages ago, we've got some Latin here to deal with. Not too different from what the same phrase would mean in French or Spanish. Spiritus Mundi, something like spirit of the world or ghost of the world. Possibly a deliberate oblique reference to another romantic and a big hero of Yeats's, Percy Shelley, and his Demon of the World. A vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight, and there begins this vision of the Sphinx. So what does Yeats mean here? Well, in the discussion board for the Friday afternoon class, apropos of I forget what, last week somebody brought up Carl Jung, the psychologist, the disciple of Sigmund Freud, and his idea of the collective unconscious. That was actually what he had his falling out with Freud about. Freud believed that psychology was an individual matter. What your dreams symbolized or whatever was specific to your upbringing, your relationship with your parents. Jung believed that there was that there was what he called a collective unconscious. That if a rich businessman in Los Angeles and a peasant farmer in China both dream that they are riding on a white horse while their teeth are falling out or whatever, that it would mean the same thing for both of them, even though they're from two different cultures, speak two different languages, two different religions, different everything. That there is some extent to which symbolism is genetic, right? That our relationships to art, to poetry, to religion, whatever, may differ on the surface, cosmetically, but ultimately we're all telling the same story. So Yeats might be invoking a similar idea here with his spiritus mundi that Jung would have been with his collective unconscious. A vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight, and then we get the image of the Sphinx, somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a monster from a much older tradition than Christianity. Now, in the old story about the Sphinx, what does the Sphinx do? Right? It asks you a riddle, and if you don't know the answer to the riddle, it eats you up. Now, anybody remember what the famous riddle of the Sphinx is? It's the one that goes, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening? The answer, of course, is man. A human being, right? Because you crawl on all 4s when you're a baby, walk on 2 legs in your adulthood, and use a cane when you're old, walking on 3 legs. So the Sphinx asks you a riddle, and the answer to the riddle is humanity, a human being. So I think that that's appropriate here, right? This poem, and really maybe the whole modernist project, is a riddle where the answer is man. And I think Yeats was smirking to himself at this when he invoked the image of the Sphinx in this poem. So this is something that predates by thousands of years the Christian story, from an older civilization, an older faith. So the implication here might be that the religion of his own time and place, Christianity, late 19th century Irish Christianity, would be insufficient, right? If there's a problem that concerns the whole world, right? Something that's threatening to destroy the whole planet, all the civilizations and all the cultures at once, then no one culture's religion or no one civilization's culture or literature or whatever is going to be the answer all by itself. You've got to go deeper and find the central story that includes everybody and that addresses everything. So that's why we have this, all, to use again Monty Python's great phrase, all mixed up in a bucket. Here we've got the Sphinx and Jesus and all of the times and all of the stories and all of the religions at once. All it is implied stemming from, flowing from the spiritus mundi, the genetic symbolism back here. In different terms with different pictures, but the same story we all tell ourselves. So the central monster, the big bad of all religions and all cultures. You call it the Sphinx, call it the Antichrist, call it Darth Vader, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's coming to life, right? It's moving its slow thighs. Great phrase, and we can hear and feel as though it were a movie. See the grains of sand beginning to shake and fall off as the Sphinx slowly, after thousands of years, begins to awaken, sensing, like another symbol of great evil, the One Ring in Tolkien. The ring awakens, right, sensing that its time has come. The Sphinx senses that its time has come and awakens, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. So just as, Sauron, who's to stick with Tolkien, whose life force is bound up in the One Ring, calls all evil to him, summons all armies to him. The Sphinx summons the big bad guy, summons all the little bad guys to him. The indignant desert birds, vultures, scavengers, carrion birds, not noble hunters like the falcon of the beginning of the poem, but ugly, unnoble scavenger birds. These are the beings who flock to the monster. Indignant, great adjective. They feel as though they're the monster. Scavenger cowards who imagine that they have beef with everybody. And we're feeling now, what this has to do with real life, not just in 1 year, but over and over. 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. We swing back towards a Christian image again, the idea of 2,000 years. The rocking cradle, presumably the cradle of the Christ child, as though that was the moment that the Sphinx, the Antichrist, the monster, the whatever he is, decided to go hide, to go to sleep. But now it's his turn to come back. What rough beast? It's our come round at last, right? Its time has come. Slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Slouches, great verb. So it's implied that the monster is headed towards Bethlehem, the same place where in the traditional story Jesus is born, I guess, to reenact the nativity by giving birth to the Antichrist or the Sphinx Junior or whatever, initiating some kind of final battle. And this might be the most important word to notice in the whole poem. It's slouching there. It's not striding there. I love that Yeats used that word because it reminds us that bad guys, that evil, right, in real life, are gross, messy. In movies, bad guys often look very cool. Count Dracula or Darth Vader, it's flowing cape, striding into cut a very fine figure, very impressive. Bad guys in real life never look that cool. They look normal, unimpressive, schlubby, chubby, dumb. That's why we don't notice that they're the bad guy until it's too late. Now, this image of evil awaking and calling these sort of indignant scavenger idiots to it. If you told people that this had been written, last year about Trump and his followers, people would believe it. And most of you, since we're talking about the first half of the 20th century, are probably thinking, oh, well, it must be about Hitler, right? It was probably written in the 1930s or something about Hitler and the Nazis. Amazingly, no. This poem was written in 1919. Nobody even knew who Hitler was yet. But there was, like all great poets, Yeats sensed something. There's a mood in Europe now, or maybe even in the whole world now, that somebody is going to step into and take advantage of in a way that is not going to end up going good. Exactly what this guy's name is, or what country he's going to turn up in, or what type of mustache he's going to have, we don't know yet. But I see where this is going, and this poem does what I think all of the best poems do. It is extremely specific, yet general and eternal at the same time. We talked when we looked at that speech from Shakespeare, the All the World's a Stage speech, because it seems like a year ago, but last month or whenever that was, about how even though it was written over 400 years ago, in a culture that was unimaginably different from our own, Shakespeare had this eye for all of the stuff that was never going to change, right? The little children creeping like snail unwillingly to school, or the depressed teenager sighing like furnace, or the guy in his early 20s with his insubstantial goatee and strings of profanity, full of strange oaths and bearded like the pard. It's just as true now as it was hundreds of years ago when Shakespeare wrote it, even though so much else has changed. And yet it's still specific rather than vague. This poem, and Yeats is just one of the very best ever to write in English. I'll admit probably, at least for my money, top 5 ever, alongside Emily Dickinson. One of the others I would put, only below Shakespeare. He's looking around at the world and noticing something extremely specific and putting it in a memorable, specific, picturable way, yet it doesn't get old. If you read this poem in 1933 and it seems like it's about Hitler and the Nazis, you read it in 2019, 100 years after it was written, and it seems like it's about Trump and his followers. And whoever the next a-hole is in another 100 years or 500 years, you read the poem then, and it'll seem like it must have been written with that guy in mind. The best poetry is, as they say, news that stays news. Okay, so let's I do want to look at Eliot, but we don't. How are we on time? Oh, cool. You know what? That was kind of heavy. Let's recalibrate with those two very short ones. Turn, if you would, to the two William Carlos Williams poems, The Red Wheelbarrow and This Is Just to Say. Now, if the name William Carlos Williams sounds familiar, it's because we encountered his work back in the poetry unit. That was the guy who wrote that story, The Use of Force, about the doctor and the little girl who won't open her mouth. Here he is with his poetry. Now, this first one, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow, glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. What the hell was that? Why does it count as a poem? Now, Williams is drawing upon a trend in modernism that was called, where can I even write this? I'll write it over here. A modernist trend called imagism, that was based on the Japanese haiku tradition. Now you've probably already heard of haiku as, oh, those are those 3-line poems where the lines go 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. Traditional Japanese haiku, it's a bit more intricate than that. It's tied, first of all, to the time of year or time of day. The first line, or kigo, I think it's called, invokes what time of year it is and what time of day it is. So it might say, winter dawn, summer midnight. And then the last 2 lines present an image, not any interpolation of it by the poet. I feel this way or I feel that way. But a visual, as though it were painting in words. And you then meditate upon or reflect upon what that symbolizes. So modernists, the English-speaking modernists, drew on this as yet another way of, making the reader do work. I'm not just going to tell you how I feel. I'm going to present an image, and you're supposed to do the work of figuring out what it means. And if all we had were the last 3 lines, a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens, we would merely have a still image. Those lines are preceded with an argumentative claim, right? The fact that so much depends upon these things. And we're like, okay, I'll bite. Why does so much depend upon the red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens? Now, this is joke is the wrong word, but there's a sort of aha moment in here, because even though it is a still image, it implies a story. Right? Just as if you see a still photograph of one person like this and another person like this and a ball in the air between them, you know that what happened right before the photograph was taken is this guy threw the ball, and what is going to happen right after the photograph is this person's going to catch it. So even though it's a single image, there is an implied before and after. So this seems like a bucolic, optimistic, lovely, farm image, a capital N nature image straight out of Romanticism, until we ask ourselves about the story, until we pose to ourselves the question, well, if there's a wheelbarrow beside the white chickens, what's about to happen to those chickens? Now, the answer, presumably, is that they're about to get the chop, right? The wheelbarrow is to throw the bodies of the chickens in after they are killed. So it seems pretty at first, and then you realize what's actually going on. And what we might notice after that is, okay, in the visual part of the poem, the last 3 stanzas, the wheelbarrow is red, the chickens are white. In the second to last stanza, we don't have a named color, but water is the only thing in it. When you're a kid and you're drawing a picture, what color do you normally make water? Blue. So now you've got red, white, and blue. Okay, so does this have something to do, as several of the other poems in this packet do, with America? Looks all pretty at first until you realize what's about to happen to the chickens. Possibly. So, doing a fair amount for a few words, as is this next poem. This is just to say. it begins in the title, dismissing itself. Nothing to see here. This is just to say. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. I love the way that the S sounds at the end, so sweet and so cold, make you want to whisper it. It gets zooms in, gets more intimate. At the end, this is a thing you'll notice if you're reciting it out loud to yourself. So this is yet another exhortation to be reading poetry out loud to yourself as you are studying it. You'll learn more about it that way. Okay, so there is an addressee, right? There's a you. What do we know about the relationship between the speaker and the addressee? Well, if you're telling them, or I suppose leaving them a note, right? The poem seems to be aping or invoking the idea of a note left on the fridge. Just to say we're out of plums, as you might leave someone that you live with a note to say we're out of milk or we're out of whatever. Now, presumably the relationship is a romantic one, right? If you're leaving someone a note about the plums in the icebox, it's probably someone you live with. But it goes rather beyond what a note of such a type would normally do. This is just to say I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, but it goes beyond that, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Why would you admit that? If you actually knew that the other person was saving them for breakfast, you'd act like you didn't know that. Oh, you were saving those? I'm sorry, I thought you didn't even like plums. I had no idea, right? You wouldn't admit that you knew that. Forgive me? You're apologizing, you're asking for forgiveness, but you're also admitting that you knew the person was saving them and you ate them anyway? And then you go on and on about how good they were. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. If you're actually apologizing, you wouldn't admit you knew the person was saving them, and you wouldn't go on and on about how good they were. This is, to use another modern political term, what we now call a non-apology apology, right? It's acting like it's apologizing, but it isn't. So in both of these poems, we could see a bit of I guess modernist role play about an image that we can analyze until it becomes an implication of yet another American dream, not all it's cracked up to be thing, like in Langston Hughes. We can see Williams taking on a voice in that second poem of once again, something that seems pretty at first, but then the more you look at it, it becomes deliberately, pointlessly cruel, becomes, as in the last two words of the poem itself, so cold. Okay, you know what? I see that we're coming up on an hour and a half. Why don't we cap it there and do a Modernism Part 2? So yes, that seems like the best thing to do, because there's more I want to say, but this is already getting out of control. So I'll post this now. I'll open up the discussion boards and look for Modernism Part 2 in the next couple of days.